I'm Jane Conover. I'm president of the York County Community Foundation, and I am thrilled to launch our first in a series of virtual webinars that's going to dig deeper into the issues facing our community. Because it will take all of us to address these issues, we are calling this series Together We Thrive. Now, while you can all see me, I can't see or hear you, but I ask you to stay engaged by submitting your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much for being here. Your attendance tells me that you care about your community, that you want to be well informed, and that you have a role to play in helping others thrive. YCCF's vision is that your county is united, prosperous, and growing, with opportunities for everyone to thrive. We seek to fuel community transformation by inspiring transformational philanthropy and grant making. This year, YCCF is embarking on a new direction for our grant making. Our focus is to help lower-income children, individuals, and families achieve lasting financial security. That means that youth have access to quality education and support to prepare them for the workplace. It means they have quality, affordable housing in safe neighborhoods. It means people have stable living wage employment that includes benefits and enables them to save. It means older adults have information and support to enjoy their later years. In short, it means that people are thriving, not just surviving. The pandemic made it crystal clear that more people in York County are living on the edge than we even imagined. In fact, 32% of York County households are living on a survival budget or less. That means they live paycheck to paycheck, having no savings, and are just one car repair away from a financial crisis. People living in York City and communities of color are disproportionately at risk. Nearly 7 in 10 households in York City earn less than $50,000, compared to 4 in 10 households in York County. Only 60% of Black households in York County earn a living wage, compared to 70% of white households, and only 12% of Hispanic workers earn a living wage. Financial hardships impact many older adults as well. Roughly 1 in 3 older adults in York County are financially insecure and struggle to pay housing and healthcare costs. YCCF evaluated this data. We listened to community members and organizations that are close to these challenges. And we concluded that financial security is fundamental not only to a person's well-being, but is critical to a prosperous and growing county. Our priorities will be to support holistic programs and collaboratives that address the complex barriers that people face. We're going to expand access and impact on historically marginalized groups. And third, we'll collaborate with community partners like the United Way and YCEA, who are also focused on economic mobility to achieve more together. We're delighted to have with us today someone who is not only studying these issues, but is actively working to empower communities to address them. Ashley Putnam is director of the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, a strategic initiative of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, dedicated to inclusive economic growth and creating pathways out of poverty in communities across the 3rd District and the nation. Before joining the bank, Putnam served as the Economic Development Advisor for the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development in New York City. She also served at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and America Works of New York. Ashley has a master's degree in public administration from New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service and a bachelor's from Barnard College. Thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us today from across the country even.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for having me. Yes, I am so excited to be here today. And this is such a critical moment in the work that you are doing together in York. And it is so important to me that I am joining you at 5 a.m. my time because I'm actually joining you from California. So that is my way of saying, please excuse me if I am a little more tired than usual, but also I'm just so excited and pleased to be here because of the York County Community Foundation's commitment to really advancing economic mobility and economic inclusion. So this is just such an important topic. And I'm very excited to be able to share with you some of the work that we're doing at the Federal Reserve Bank that I hope helps make the case for the work you're continuing to do together. So before I get started, I do have to give the standard Federal Reserve disclaimer, which is that the views expressed here today are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So now that that's out of the way, The first question I usually get asked when I speak about my work is, why does the Federal Reserve care about economic mobility? Why do we have a strategic project on this topic? What is the work that we can do? And why is this important for the economy? And so the first answer, of course, is that we have a dual mandate at the Federal Reserve, which may be something you've heard about more than usual in the news recently. The first part of that mandate is probably the part that you hear about the most, which is the ensuring price stability. That's the conversation we hear about interest rates, inflation, what's going on in the economy largely. But we also have a mandate around maximum employment. And we often don't think about what the role is that we can play to advance everyone's connection to opportunity, particularly around the labor market. And so that's what I'm excited to share with you a little bit today. So economic mobility, where are we? Why does this matter? Why is this a critical conversation for this country at this moment in time, and for folks like all of you that are serving your county? Well, the first thing that we know is that economic growth that has been experienced in this country since 1975 has not translated into shared prosperity. So we've really seen disparate economic growth. If you look at the period between 1947 and 1975, we see that the bottom 20% and the bottom 5% grew at about the same rate, right? We experienced relatively similar share in family income growth. When we look at the more recent period from 1975 to 2010, that growth has really predominantly been in the top 5%, and the growth we see in that bottom 20% is a little bit weaker. And so this is something we're curious about. What does this mean? How does this impact the economy? Well, one thing we know is that it impacts the story that we tell about the economy. So we often talk about this concept of the American dream, right? And it's something I was certainly raised on, and I'm sure many of you are, which is to say that, we are able to be raised and educated in a country where we are able to achieve incredible. What we have found when we look at the data is that if you are born after 1980, you are less likely to be economically better off than your parents than in previous generations. And so if you can see that data there, what we see here is that people born in 1940 were 92% more likely to be better off than their parents. People born in 1980 were only 50% more likely. So this is why the Economic Growth and Mobility Project exists. It isn't just because we see that inequality, it is because that inequality is actually a problem for our economy. So when we look at research, this is research from the International Monetary Fund on countries across the world, what we see is that countries that grow that bottom 20% that I've been talking about actually experience gains in GDP, right? Countries that only grow that top 20% actually experience a small decrease. And now logically, this makes sense, and I'll explain a little bit why. But one of the things that we know from this work is that this isn't just about helping lower income Americans, helping people who are experiencing poverty. This is a really critical conversation for all of us. So regardless of where you fit in that income, it actually impacts how your economy is doing, whether it is resilient, whether it is inclusive, and whether we continue to grow. And so that's the case I'd like to make to you today for your county, for the future, and for what you're building collectively here. So let's kind of go into why. Why does it matter if the bottom 20% gets a little bit more income? So what we see when the bottom 20% has just very basic needs met is that people take that very small amount of money they have and they spend it on needs, right? Things like healthcare, things that are must-haves, right? If you have to make a critical decision, what do you have to provide for your family? But when you give people a little bit more cash, and I will say we're kind of in a massive social experiment of what that looks like over the past 2 years, and I'll talk a little bit about how that impacts the data. What we saw when we provided people stimulus, extended unemployment, and other sorts of social safety nets through the pandemic is that that additional cash was then generated back into the economy. All right, so the bottom 20% are consumers. The top 5% are savers. They're going to put that money into saving. So the bottom 20%, we're spending that money on your local business, your local hardware shop, right? That money is going back into economies like small businesses in York County. And it's actually in turn creating jobs to the hands of consumers. So we can see this virtuous cycle that exists as a result of increasing the incomes of the bottom 20%. We also think this virtuous cycle has larger benefits for the economy. We know that there are talents that are often untapped, that are often kept on the sidelines or not recognized. And when we invest in those talents, what we see is new types of innovation, new kinds of products coming forth, new services, and those innovations create new businesses, and those businesses create new jobs, and those jobs create local wealth, right? They go back into the local economy and they create local assets, which of course then spurs more local talents. So these are several reasons why we believe it's really important to think about inclusion, not just because it's the right thing to do, although we do strongly believe it is a moral imperative and something we should talk about, but because it's also economically important for all of us collectively. So this is why I exist and the work I do at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia exists. So the project I lead, the strategic initiative, is called the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. And we focus on three really critical pillars to us of inclusive economic growth. The first is infrastructure equity. So thinking about things like access to transportation, affordable housing, broadband internet, a few things I might touch on today. As I say this, I hope my broadband internet is going all right as I am at my parents' home and I may not have a fantastic connection, so I apologize. Very critical things we have learned in the pandemic. We also talk a lot about the workforce, and that will be probably what I'll spend most of my time today chatting with you about, things like education, barriers to employment, skill development, again, those talent lines that are really critical to our economic growth into an inclusive recovery. And then the final thing is job creation. How are we ensuring that we are fostering the types of jobs that are providing pathways to the middle class, that are providing economic stability, that are providing opportunities for entrepreneurship and shared wealth and shared growth? This is our thesis at the Economic Growth and Mobility Project on what inclusive recovery could look like. It's investment in what is local, local infrastructure, local talents, and local businesses. And that is why I'm so excited to be here with you today, because that is exactly what you all are together planning to do to improve the economy of York County. So I can't be here today and not talk about the elephant in the room, which is that all of these critical conversations were really important before we got to this massive disruptive pandemic that has in many ways exacerbated some of these really important, huge issues that we were already concerned about regarding inequality, regarding racial equity, regarding what is happening to low and moderate income Americans in this country. So let's talk a little bit about that. We have been talking at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia about the concept of equity. And I want to clarify very quickly what equity is versus equality. Equality is when we all get the same treatment, right? So everybody got a stimulus check. Equity is where people who have historically been left behind, who have historically been left out of our labor market, who have historically experienced more economic insecurity, are really centered and focused in the policies we have in recovery. And so I want to talk about why that matters. We all know that we see massive disparities in our numbers around unemployment, around poverty. I saw a question in the chat earlier, what happens when you disaggregate these poverty numbers by race? And that's the right question to ask, because we really do see disproportionate impacts. Black and Hispanic workers historically, throughout this entire pandemic, have faced 1.6 to 2 times the unemployment rates of their white counterparts. So even now, as we celebrate how the economy is coming back and how the labor market is looking great, if you look at the number for Black unemployment or Hispanic unemployment or Black women's unemployment or Hispanic women's unemployment, it's not looking very good. And that is a concern, because we see in previous recessions that Black and Hispanic workers, women, and people without a college degree or four-year credential are slower to regain employment and rebuild assets in recovery. We also know and have heard, as many of you have heard on the news, that nearly 2.3 million women had left the workforce since the start of the pandemic. Now, many are coming back, and that's exciting news, and we're seeing great gains in our employment numbers, and I'm looking forward to the new employment numbers that drop this Friday to see again how many people are connecting back into the labor market. But the fact that we saw that huge disparity and that it fell disproportionately on women, and particularly women of color, is really concerning when we think about our recovery. And the reason is, again, that's being slower to regain employment, being slower to rebuild assets, I mentioned before, but it's also about preventing long-term dislocations. So to make sure that this isn't an extended economic crisis, we have to ensure that our inequalities promote a more equitable recovery for workers. And this is incredibly important for the economy. the economic loss of racial and gender disparities we did a study on earlier this year with our colleagues at the San Francisco Fed. We wanted to understand what would happen if we closed the racial and gender gaps in the labor market in the American economy. And what we found is that we are losing out on $2.6 trillion. So again, this isn't just about the right thing to do, this is about what we are losing as an economy as a whole. This is an inclusive recovery, and equitable recovery matters to all of us. And I hope that's something you can take away from our presentation today. So we're going to talk about inclusion. And we're going to talk about the work that you're doing today. We get to talk about one of my very favorite topics, which is poverty. And what do we call poverty? How do we define poverty, right? This is one of those things we talk about a lot, but sometimes we know about not so much. And so one of the questions that I always hear is, what does that mean? What is the word poverty? How are we measuring that, right? We heard Jane share some numbers. I'll share some numbers as well in terms of what poverty looks like in York County. But I want you to, before we go into these numbers and understand what they look like, try to kind of imagine what this means. So you're budgeting for your week and you're thinking about how much money you put aside every week to live off of. Now, the current poverty threshold for the United States is $26,000 for a family of 4. That's 4 people living on that amount of money. Or if we make it individual for just one person, it's about $13,000 for one person. Now, these are our most recent poverty thresholds, I believe, as of earlier this year, a little bit higher than it used to be, but $13,000 for one person is not very much money each week. And so I want us to understand that the threshold when we talk about poverty is extremely low. All right, getting someone over that poverty line, while that is an important and ambitious goal, if they're making $14,000 or $15,000 a year, we still have work to do. They're still not experiencing economic security. They're still not able to necessarily know that they can provide for their family. They're still not able to have that extra cash to purchase things from local businesses, and again, to generate economic growth. So I hope we can start this conversation by saying that poverty, alleviating poverty is an important goal, but it is beyond just addressing poverty. In fact, what we know is that most people in poverty don't just experience this as a static place, right? We often talk about the poor as a category, as if they exist in this solid kind of concrete way. And what we actually see is more like economic insecurity. There's a great author, Jonathan Murdoch, who does work called The Diaries of the Poor. And I encourage you to read that work, both nationally and internationally, because what we learn is that people experience these fluctuations in income, right? Sometimes there are moments where they're above that line, sometimes there are moments where they're below that line. So again, as we measure this, we're actually still not capturing most of the economic insecurity that we experience. So in the Federal Reserve Bank, we conduct a survey of households, and Jane kind of alluded to one of these statistics. And we found earlier, I believe this is from last year, that 1 in 5 households cannot afford an emergency cash expense of $400. So your car breaks down on the way to work, you have an emergency medically that you have to provide for. People do not have cash on hand that they can easily pull down to be able to cover those emergency expenses. So that tells us something about economic insecurity, that it's a lot bigger than the poverty rate, right? We also know that there are other ways we can measure economic security, and Jane alluded to this, and I think this is just a fantastic measure. This is called ALICE, which is Asset Limited Income Strained Employed. And it's a way for us to talk about people who are working, but still experiencing economic insecurity. And so that goes beyond that poverty rate, really to understand what does economic insecurity look like more largely. So let's talk about York County really quickly. So the current poverty rate as of 2021 census data in York County is 7.3%, which interestingly is a little bit lower than it was in 2019 at 10.3%. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I think that might be the case. That being said, we see that there's huge disparities within that number. So that's still, again, 32,000 people. So I want us to think about that as it's not just, oh, that's not a terrible number, let's move on. 32,000 people experiencing poverty is 32,000 people who do not make that $13,000 a year, right? Again, an extremely low bar, and we should really be concerned about the experiences of those 32,000 people. But also that poverty is really concentrated. And in fact, this York City, we see 31% of the city is living in poverty. So again, as Jane mentioned, these are things that are really critical in terms of urban and rural, in terms of lines around race and gender, in terms of who's experiencing poverty. We also know that people in York County are working, but not necessarily experiencing financial security. So unemployment in York County is 3.2%. That's great. We're really excited that unemployment is very low. 65% of working adults are active in the labor force. That's also great. But again, that doesn't necessarily capture their experiences of economic security. And actually, when we look at ALICE, which is again this measure that United Way uses to talk about people who are working poor or working in economic insecurity, we see that 24% of households in York County are ALICE. And that means they're living on less than $23,000 for a single adult. And I think that's a number that's actually more worthy of focusing on, because 7% feels like something you can easily walk away from. 24%, that's a quarter of your population that is experiencing economic insecurity. And that's really why this work is so important and so critical. Now, I mentioned again that there are other things we're going to talk about in terms of poverty, in terms of the work that we do at the Federal Reserve Bank. One thing I will mention is transportation. We've done some work in the past in York County around this issue, and we know it can be really critical in terms of accessing opportunity. The average commute in the county is about 30 minutes, but that includes if you're in a car. So you imagine a lot of people in York County are driving. And in fact, I think we've looked at some data that show that York County has a lot of commuting to Harrisburg, to Baltimore. There are a lot of people who are driving to opportunities. But if you don't have a car and you can't drive to opportunity, we conducted some research looking at opportunity employment, and those are jobs that pay above the median annual wage adjusted for cost of living, which is about $31,000 in York County. And what we found was if you are a low-income York County resident, you can access about 7% of those great paying jobs that don't require a college degree within a 60-minute commute. And that's really concerning. That means that if you don't have a car, there is a lot of opportunity that isn't available to you. And I'm happy to share that study there as well. We also know that the digital divide impacts York County residents. And again, this data is only as recent as 2019, and it is something we have talked about a lot, and there's been great work done around. So, but as of 2019 census data, only 11% of households do not have a computer at home in York County, and 18% of households do not have broadband access. And so while you have roads to physically take you to work, we understand that in these days, as we are communicating digitally, broadband access is a physical infrastructure that is really, really critical for people to access opportunity. So I do want to talk about this really quickly because I love to talk about these things. Why did poverty decrease in York County? So we saw that 10% number in 2019, and it was down to 7%. That's great, right? We must be doing amazing and wonderful things. Well, I have some hypothesis on this, and it's based on national data around poverty, and it's something that I'd like to make a note of really quickly. And that is the supplemental poverty rate. And this is a unique measurement. It's something we talk about a lot in my nerdy world about economic mobility and opportunity, but it's essentially measuring poverty, but including the impact of the social safety net. And so those are things like TANF, unemployment, stimulus checks. We actually include that measurement in how we measure poverty. In 2020, right, in the middle of the height of the pandemic, in the middle of this massive economic crisis that was absolutely devastating to the majority of families, had huge disruptions on the labor market, really critical in terms of our median income dropping and the poverty rate going up. What we saw was that the supplemental poverty rate was 9%, 2.3 points lower than the official poverty rate. This is the first time in the history of this measurement where that supplemental poverty rate has been lower than the official poverty rate. And the question is why? In the same way we see York County decreasing poverty maybe in that particular year, what we found is that there are policies that really did have an impact on people's experiences of poverty. Things like the child tax credit, things like unemployment insurance. So I mentioned we're in this kind of massive experiment where we've seen that stimulus checks and unemployment insurance extensions actually ameliorated poverty, right? We do have the ability to create policies that provide more cash to families and really do impact people's experiences of poverty. So I want to end my presentation on economic mobility on that note, and we are going to get into a little bit of the what can we do about it. So I know you're listening and you're thinking, great, these are pretty tough numbers, Ashley. You know, it's really sad to hear that this is the case in York County. It's really sad to hear that there are all these terrible things happening, and that so many families are really living day to day, paycheck to paycheck. What do you want me to do about it, right? We talked about these policies that are predominantly federal policies. What can we do collectively to address some of these issues? And I am so glad you asked, because that is one of my very favorite things to talk about and is part of my job at the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. So we run what we call at the Federal Reserve Research and Action Labs. And this is really where we bring our research to bear on some of these critical issues around economic recovery and economic equity. These labs are community driven, they're innovative, they're actionable, and they're really focused on going from just talking about the problem to doing something about the problem. These labs that we conduct, they are a process, not a product. So they aren't just one report, they're not just one event. They really involve almost a 2-year process in which we work on with the community on a specific issue. We think about localized research, local partnerships, and we really try to grow from the local, right? We're not just trying to solve these issues from a federal level. And we facilitate some great conversations about how do we use that research, how do we better define our problems, and how do we apply some best practices to advance solutions. And so I'm excited to share today some solutions we've been seeing that are popping up. I get to spend a lot of time talking to people doing really awesome things, and I think it's absolutely my favorite part of my job. And I'm having a little trouble dropping my links, so I'm hoping we can drop some of these in the chat as well, but I'm happy to share afterwards. But the strategy that we launched last year is really focused on equitable recovery for workers. And what does that mean? It's not just getting people back to work. It's not just the economy reopening. It's acknowledging and examining root causes of employment disparities, things that existed long before this pandemic and will continue to exist afterwards if we don't address them. Targeting interventions to populations disproportionately impacted. Again, equity, not equality. Who is being left behind? Who is left out? We know that women and women of color were the predominant group that was first impacted in 2020. And that's because they were very present in hospitality and retail and those frontline jobs. So how do we target our interventions to those populations? Removing barriers to work, training, and education, encouraging improved job quality, as well as supports for workers. So providing worker supports to be able to make transitions between jobs if they choose to, and increasing access to career pathways that lead to financial stability. So I want to talk about 3 sort of buckets today, and then I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to hear a little more from all of you. The first thing here is just the reducing barriers bucket, right? We talked about this a tiny bit, the digital divide in York County, access to transportation, but a really critical one in this moment in time has also been access to childcare. So we know from our research at the Federal Reserve that childcare remains a major barrier to individuals who are looking to get back to work, particularly to women, on why women are leaving the workforce, but that we really see this childcare as part of that critical infrastructure. So that broadband access is also one of those critical infrastructure pieces for accessing training and work. And what is exciting to me is that we're seeing some amazing things happening around the state of Pennsylvania. Some of those things include investments in digital infrastructure, as well as cross-sector collaborations. And I think that's one of the most important things here is that the childcare problem isn't just a state issue. It isn't just a federal issue. It's also an issue for local communities and for businesses. Likewise, we are seeing some great things like Drive Pennsylvania as an economic development group that has been really thinking critically about how they invest in broadband access and digital infrastructure. I'm happy to share that resource in a bit. So addressing bias in hiring. Again, we're thinking about equitable recovery for workers. The first thing is to remove those barriers. The next thing is to open the door. And honestly, I'm really excited to talk to you about this today because it was actually mentioned very briefly in the State of the Union last night. But there are some really exciting things happening in, especially in the private sector, actually, around how people are reassessing talent. We have an incredible amount of research at the Federal Reserve Bank that demonstrates that just because you are in a low-wage job does not mean you are low-skilled. And in fact, a lot of our low-wage workers have incredible talents that we are leaving on the sidelines when we use something like a 4-year college degree as the barrier to decide whether you are in or out of a job. And so we're seeing some incredible employers, IBM, Accenture, major national companies coming together to say, we're going to take away that degree requirement and we're going to prioritize competency-based or skills-based hiring and assessments. And then finally, a big focus on quality jobs. And this is the part that I call raise the floor and build the ladder, right? So raising the floor means we consider things like wages, schedule stability, and other aspects of job quality in our economic investments, right? So for those of us who work on the economic development side, what jobs and opportunities are we growing? What are we creating in York County? That is the raising the floor piece of the work. And how are we making sure we protect workers and give them agency and opportunity? But there's also this building the ladder, right? And again, back to low-wage workers possessing these incredible skill sets that we are not tapping into. So what kinds of things can we do to remove those barriers to upskill workers? So we've engaged in some great partnerships this past year around a project called Workforce Realigned. And again, I'll drop some of these in the chat shortly, where we partnered with private and public institutions to reduce risks to workers in training. And what we've seen are just some incredible things, including a major launch from Google this past year, where students are able to access high quality industry training at lower costs and at lower risk. And so those are some of the things that we want to be thinking through locally. How do we work together to address some of these barriers? And finally, I want to encourage you guys as I close today to remember to put people at the center of your work. I shared a bunch of really grim numbers today. It's a thing we do a lot at the Federal Reserve Bank. We talk about data, we talk about numbers. Of course, we love things that are based on research, but I want to remind you that these are human beings beyond those numbers. These are people experiencing that economic insecurity, that are uncertain about that next meal, that are uncertain about how they'll provide for their family. And these are people who are our greatest asset and are often untapped in our economy. And so one way to put people at the center is to really think about how we can shift the narrative. Again, we talk about low-wage workers, but not low-skilled workers, right? We understand that those people in our economy have incredible skills, incredible talents. That could be your next major entrepreneur that we're leaving on the sideline when we talk about them as low-skilled. So how do we think about the narratives that we utilize? How do we think about what we talk about when we talk about poverty in a way that isn't just about a person in a static state, but a person who is going through an experience that we can collectively help make better? I'd also encourage you to think about where workers, and particularly low-wage workers, are informing your policies. I'm leading a really exciting project this year at the Federal Reserve Bank to hear from workers directly about their choices and their experiences during this great resignation and during this labor shortage. So how can we better bring workers into the work that you do? Do you have a board potentially of workers who are informing projects, or potentially inviting to hear from them on the work that you're doing collectively? And remembering again that this is about people who are in real crisis, and that the opportunity is not just for them. This is really a collective opportunity for all of us to come together as a region, to come together as a country, and make sure that we're growing in a way that is inclusive and better for the economy in the long term. So thank you so much for having me. I'll stop my share here today, and I'll share some links. And I think, am I supposed to take some questions?
We're turning it over to Adrian. We're going to do questions at the end.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Ashley. We really appreciate that. And that's the reason why we are doing what we do. Everything that you have provided reinforces the work that we still have ahead of us. And one of the ways we're looking to address some of these disparities and really begin to have some significant impacts and move the needle is through our Thrive grants. So we look to focus on programs and collaboratives that are transforming lives in our community by helping low-income children, individuals, and families achieve what we're calling that lasting financial security. So our focus is really to look at the person as a whole and find out and understand where are those gaps, what are those services, what are those critical things that the individual needs to put them on the path of creating lasting financial security. We want to ensure that every individual within your county has the ability to be successful. So how do we understand and begin to work to provide them with those support systems? How do we remove those barriers? As Ashley mentioned, we talk about childcare, we talk about transportation. What is it that we can do? So part of our deeper dive was just really having conversations with community members, with organizations to get a better understanding of the needs. We would look to really support that holistic approach for all these complex issues. One thing that we know is that we can't do it by ourselves. We need partners all throughout the community to help us to create the path forward. but all of our work, we're making sure we utilize that diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. We look to engage diverse folks all throughout the community. We want to make sure that from our grant readers who are helping to put those dollars out there to those small grassroots organizations that sometimes might not have all the resources like the larger organizations, but they can have a great impact within the community. We want to make sure we're partnering with all of them. We're doing outreach. We're making sure that everyone understands the funds that are available, how they can use them, and most important, we want them to see the York County Community Foundation not just as a funder, but as a partner, someone who you can come to help you through the process, to help you access the dollars, and most importantly, that can help you to be successful in meeting your mission and, of course, our joint mission of making York County a better place. One of the organizations that we've partnered with over the years is Community Progress Council. And we are excited about their economic mobility program, which are one of the funders there, really helping to see some great things happening. We have Robin, who's going to do a presentation and really do a deeper dive into the work that's happening with CPC, how they're doing it, and the great success they're experiencing. So again, thank you so much. And Robin, you take it from here.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate the opportunity to present today to everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm up. Is that correct? In 2019, Community Progress Council went to the York County Community Foundation to ask for financial support to create a new program called the Self-Sufficiency Program. Today, I'm going to share a little bit of information about how their contribution has enabled us to really transform the way we meet our mission at Community Progress Council. Community Progress Council has been serving York County since 1965. We're a big organization with lots of programs, and lots of people know us because of one or another one of our programs. Maybe it's Head Start or WIC or our housing programs. Frequently, when I share information about our organization, I'm surprised by how many people ask where we're located. So today I wanted to share a picture of our building. This is our main building at 226 East College Avenue. This is one of 25 or so locations that we have, and approximately 220 of the finest people in our community are employed by Community Progress Council. Community Progress Council is York County's community action agency. Our mission is to empower individuals and families to move towards self-sufficiency and to advocate for change to promote community growth. In York County, my estimate is, and I'm probably using old data, so forgive me, that we have approximately 45,000 York County residents living in poverty. But our mission statement doesn't talk about poverty, it talks about self-sufficiency. We estimate that there are closer to 150,000 residents in York County living below the self-sufficiency level. Let me take a minute to describe the difference between those two. My conversation will mirror a bit of what Ashley has already talked about, so I'll be a bit more brief about this. The federal poverty guidelines are established by the federal government, obviously, every year, and they're largely used to determine eligibility for various public assistance programs. The data shows that a poverty level wage for a family of four is 3.5 times lower than a self-sufficiency wage. So if it takes if poverty is 20-something thousand for 4 people, in comparison, a self-sufficiency wage for a family of 4 is closer to $96,000. So again, that's 3.5 times what the poverty level is. Self-sufficiency is defined by having the ability to pay for food, housing, childcare, healthcare, transportation without any form of public or private assistance. It is a no-frills budget. It does not include resources for people to save for retirement, college, and certainly not for vacation. The interesting thing about self-sufficiency, and in my opinion, the most useful piece to that, is that it is adjusted based on where people live and the composition of their family. I think we can all agree that in York County, our cost of living is much lower than in, say, New York City. And so our self-sufficiency wages are lower than a family of four in New York City. Similarly, a family of four with two very young children, say under the age of 5, requires a greater income to be self-sufficient than a family of four with possibly two teenagers, both of whom could be working and contributing to the household expenses. So the self-sufficiency levels are also generated based on the composition and the geographic location of the family. At CPC, our mission is to get people to self-sufficiency. Our target audience is those 150,000 people in York County, and our goal is to get them completely off of any form of public or private assistance. Nearly 10 years ago, the Community Progress Council Board of Directors and team reviewed our mission statement and tried to analyze whether or not our services were aligned with our mission of self-sufficiency. And what we determined was that actually what we were providing at that point in time helped people to maintain themselves in poverty, but did not necessarily help them make progress in their lives. As a result, we decided to transform our service model, and we stepped away from providing emergency services as a primary kind of service in our organization. As Adrian has mentioned, in 2019, we went to the Community Foundation and asked for resources to start the self-sufficiency program. Through that program, people start that service by participating in a multi-week conversation called Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By World group. People discuss the causes and conditions of poverty in their lives and in the community. And importantly, they learn that being poor or low income isn't just about money. As Ashley mentioned, it is about having an inadequate education. It's about poor housing. It's about unreliable transportation, inequities in the community, and a lack of social connectedness that allows someone to turn to another person when they're in a financial jam and say, hey, can you help me out? Typically low income people don't have those kinds of connections. By the end of this facilitated conversation, the participants have a view for their future and a clearer understanding of what it will take them to move forward. For those who are extremely motivated, because again, the path to triple your income is a long and rocky road. For folks who are motivated to buckle down and really address the issues of self-sufficiency, we offer them the opportunity to engage in a coaching relationship with us. Every one of the self-sufficiency clients or program participants has an educational or an employment goal that they are pursuing. But probably one of the most impactful aspects of this program is that we have resources set aside to help people as their income increases. Many of you are probably familiar with a concept called the benefits cliff. And what that refers to is as people are increasing their income, they are losing public benefits. Frequently, the loss of benefits, the value of those benefits is greater than the income that they are receiving. And so they actually end up falling farther behind. Through Community Progress Council's self-sufficiency program, we have funding to bridge that gap. So if a person has a difficult time paying a utility bill or has an unfortunate expense for medication for their child, we can backfill income that they don't have because of a loss of benefits and keep that person stable. We do that with the understanding that that is temporary financial help and that we are going to continue working with them to pursue additional income. I'm going to, in the next slide, allow Christine, a self-sufficiency client, to describe the impact that our program has had on her over the years. Let's see if I can make this happen.
I literally moved here with nothing but $32 and a child. That was it. We came from a different kind of city life. Those people around you that just constantly saying that you can have, and just realizing that, like, I just need better for me and my kids, and we're not going to make any progress as long as we stay in this environment. The first CPC staff member that I've met, her name is Jadera. She listed so many other programs and things that they had to offer, and by starting with the self-sufficiency classes, I was able to meet like wonderful people that I'm still in contact with, have grown close to, like they're like close friends now. Like we hang out all the time, our kids play together, even go to the same schools now. Sometimes it's like hard when it's like you're looking at your own life. It's like, oh, I still have things to do and I still have steps to go. But it's like when I first came to CPC, I didn't even know where I was going to live. By next year, we'll be in our own home. Like we won't be renting anymore. We'll be owning a home. I took it one step at a time, got myself out of debt, built my credit score up. Like I've done so much since I've been working with them. I know what I'm capable of now. Like, and I wouldn't never learned that about myself had I not met the wonderful staff at CPC.
I'm proud to tell you that we have lots of success stories like Christine's since 2019. We're successful because program participants direct their own journey, and we provide them with a comprehensive response to their needs. Based on Christine's comments, I know she was involved in our financial literacy services, housing counseling, one of our early childhood education programs, and workforce services, in addition to being a participant in our self-sufficiency program. It's through weaving those services together and providing a coach to help Christine stay focused and motivated that we can support her as she moves forward. We believe very strongly that it is that comprehensive integrated service that is necessary to make progress.
I literally moved here with nothing.
Sorry. As we were implementing the self-sufficiency program, it became clear to us that a client-centered approach to providing comprehensive integrated services would benefit everyone coming to Community Progress Council, not just those participating in the intensive self-sufficiency program. In order to make that possible, we restructured many of our processes, as shown in this diagram. In 2020, we centralized our intake functions. Now, anyone coming to Community Progress Council meets first with a resource navigator who collects basic demographic information, assesses people's needs, explains all of the programs that are available to them, and connects them to a coach for ongoing services. Prior to 2020, we only had coaching for a limited number of people who came to our organization. One of the other changes that we made in our organization was to expand the continuum of coaching services. So now people can receive coaching, whether it's for a short-term purpose or a longer-term self-sufficiency goal. We have people to partner with them. As you'll see from this diagram, the client or the program participant is supported by coaches, but the services around the outside are the supportive services that we have at Community Progress Council to offer to folks. That includes housing and financial literacy, our workforce development program, our women, infants, and children supplemental nutrition program, and finally, our early childhood education program. Community Progress Council can't do it all. We don't have the ability to provide healthcare or some specific job training and education programs. So when the people that we are serving need those kinds of programs, we turn to community partners and work with them to address those needs. Finally, the last part of our remodel of the service delivery system was that we were fortunate to have some flexible funding made available to us so that we can begin to now support other folks, not just those in the self-sufficiency program, when they need a flexible pot of funding to help them get over a barrier or get over a challenging financial situation. This slide outlines organizational changes that we've made in the last year or two. Through these efforts, we're integrating program functions at Community Progress Council, and soon we'll be able to describe our agency-wide impact on self-sufficiency rather than having indicators or outcomes by program. This has been a very significant culture shift for our organization. We no longer tell people what they need to do. We ask them what they want to do. We honor people for their expertise as problem solvers, and we support them with the tools to make effective decisions for long-term progress. We also coach our team members to understand that individual programs can be helpful to people, but it's together that when we weave our programs together, we can transform lives. We're not 100% there, but as we say at Community Progress Council, we are progress. We're looking ahead to consider our role in community changes. The second part of our mission statement says that we advocate for change to promote community growth. I'm very proud of the work that we do here to help 150,000 people in York County that need support from the government or churches or food pantries every month to get ahead. But we cannot hope to create a vibrant and thriving community one family at a time. Earlier in this presentation, I showed a picture of our neighborhood. CPC is an anchor in that area, and through our 2022 to 2027 strategic plan, we hope to advance neighborhood improvements. We need neighborhood and community-wide responses to create systems and policies that work for low-income people and incentivize them to make progress. I want to end by thanking the Community Foundation and others in the community for investing in Community Progress Council and the Self-Sufficiency Program. CPC is largely funded by government grants. Without private support from folks like the York County Community Foundation and without creative partnerships, Community Progress Council would have lost the ability to serve Christine once she reached 125% of poverty. It is extremely clear that we would not have left Christine in a self-sufficient status if not for the support of the Community Foundation. It's comprehensive, integrated solutions at the program, organizational, and community level that are needed to increase self-sufficiency in York County. Thank you for the opportunity to share this information with you today.
So I don't know if we have any questions that we want to get to.
Yeah.
Some that I'm seeing are related to, well, one is a specific question about York County. It said that a while back, the Fed noted that York County seems to require a degree for jobs that don't really need it. Is that still the case? It's something I discussed with Keith Wardrip when he was here in the context of opportunity professions careers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think Keith's research is really critical. The research I mentioned before that shows similarity in skills between low-wage workers and higher-wage jobs, that's also Keith's research. He has just come out with a report that was released this past month that's actually showing that workers without four-year degrees are having a moment of opportunity. And that, as opposed to in previous recoveries, we are not seeing the same amount of what we call credential inflation, where we require a college degree for a job that previously didn't require one. So I can't speak to the York County statistics in particular, but we are seeing some massive shifts in terms of what our college degree is requiring. And I'm happy to share that report also.
And one final question, and it's related. It says, how does poverty also lead or inform generational wealth?
And I will also say, how does generational wealth lead or inform poverty? So I might ask the chicken and egg there. Well, obviously, we see that income has a huge impact on your ability to save and that your ability to pass on money, but also your ability to have savings has a huge impact on your experiences of poverty. So whether or not you come from a family with generational wealth impacts whether or not you are able to, say, afford the cost of a four-year college degree, whether you're able to weather economic downturns. And so these things are, they build on each other, right? And so in the same way, if you come from wealth, you are likely to be able to create more wealth. If you do not come from wealth, it is a lot harder for you to take some of those steps and not have to deal with the financial risk of, well, if I go out of the labor market for 2 years to get this credential, who's gonna put food on the table, right? You have some sort of savings to be able to help smooth that out. But we do have some research from the St. Louis Fed on income and wealth, and I'm happy to share that in the link as well.
Thank you. And thank you, Ashley and Robin, for an informative and thought-provoking program. And thank you all who joined us today for your attention and your passion. The work you heard about today and the work that will continue is made possible by grants from the Fund for Your County. This means of flexible funding allows us the opportunity to respond to emerging needs and confront the multi-pronged and complex issues we face as a community. Our Thrive grants will support systemic and collaborative efforts to address the root causes of income insecurity to make it truly possible for all Yorkers, regardless of age, race, ability, socioeconomic status, or other factors, to thrive together. We ask that you join us in this work by contributing to the Fund for Your County, by volunteering, by informing us about promising programs with which you are familiar, and most importantly, by continuing to engage with us through these forums and others to come. We ask you to help us improve these forums by providing your feedback on today's program. You will receive a short survey to complete in the coming days, but we also invite you to reach out directly with questions and insights. Thank you again for spending this time with us. A recording of today's program will be made available, so please encourage your friends and colleagues to learn more about how together we thrive. Have a wonderful day.